The village of Hollow Creek was shrouded in mystery. To an outsider, it was a picturesque place, a quiet valley surrounded by dense forests, where mist clung to the hills and the river wound gently through the center of town. The kind of village where life seemed simpler, away from the chaos of modern cities. For John and his daughter Sarah, Hollow Creek seemed like the perfect escape. After the passing of Sarah's mother, John had sought a new beginning, a place where they could heal. Hollow Creek, with its quaint homes and peaceful atmosphere, seemed like a dream. The day they arrived, John noticed something unusual. The townspeople, though polite, were distant. Their eyes flickered with a sort of unspoken anxiety whenever he mentioned his plans to settle there. Sarah, however, was enchanted by the village's beauty. She marveled at the tall, ancient trees that lined the road to their new home, the quaint market square, and the sound of the river that flowed quietly through the village center. John convinced himself that the village's coldness was just the way of small towns. They were wary of outsiders, and in time, they would warm to him and Sarah. Their new home stood at the edge of the village, a modest cottage that had been abandoned for years. The house itself was charming but old, with wooden beams that creaked in the wind and windows that rattled slightly on cool nights. From the outside, it seemed like the perfect place for John and Sarah to start fresh, but inside, it carried the weight of history. The air inside the house felt heavy, as if it had absorbed years of sorrow from those who had lived there before. John chalked it up to the house's age, not giving it much thought. The first few nights passed quietly. Sarah seemed happy, though she began to experience strange dreams almost immediately after moving in. At first, she didn't tell John about them. The dreams were unsettling. Shadowy figures watching her from the corners of her room, the sound of whispers in a language she couldn't understand. But Sarah, being a practical girl, brushed them off as the product of stress. It wasn't until the third night that things began to change. It was late, and John was asleep when Sarah woke to the sound of something scratching at her window. At first, she thought it might be a tree branch tapping in the wind, but when she looked, there was no tree nearby. Just the faint outline of someone, standing in the darkness beyond the glass. She blinked, rubbed her eyes, and when she looked again, the figure was gone. Shaking off the experience, Sarah told herself it had just been her imagination. The next morning, Sarah mentioned the incident to her father over breakfast. It was probably just the wind, John said, dismissing her concerns. Houses this old make strange noises. I wouldn't worry about it. But there was something in Sarah's eyes that made him pause, an uneasiness that he hadn't seen before. John reassured her, promising to check the house for any loose windows or gaps that might be letting the wind in, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As the days passed, strange occurrences became more frequent. The air in the house felt colder than it should, even during the warm autumn afternoons. Shadows seemed to move just out of sight, disappearing whenever John turned to look. Sarah, normally a lively and energetic child, began to grow quiet. She spent more time alone in her room, staring out the window as if waiting for something. John tried to distract her, taking her on walks through the village, trying to introduce her to the few children that lived nearby. But Sarah remained distant. It was during one of these walks that John overheard the first whispers about the village's past. He and Sarah were walking through the market square when two elderly women standing by a stall exchanged words in hushed tones. John couldn't hear everything, but he caught fragments of their conversation. The spirits. Another disappearance. Just like before. His curiosity piqued. John approached them, but the women fell silent as soon as he drew near, their eyes widening slightly before they turned away. John brushed it off, focusing on making Sarah comfortable in their new home. He spent the next few days fixing up the house, making it more livable. The cottage had been empty for so long that the wooden floors creaked with every step, and the walls seemed to sigh under the weight of time. But John was determined to make it a home, and Sarah, despite her growing quietness, seemed to appreciate his efforts. Still, the strange occurrences continued. One night, as John was reading in the living room, he heard a faint knock at the door. It was late, too late for visitors. He opened the door cautiously, but no one was there. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees and making the house creak even louder than usual. John stepped outside, looking around, but there was no one in sight. As he turned to go back inside, he thought he saw a shadow dart across the yard, moving quickly into the forest that bordered their home. But again, when he looked closely, there was nothing there. Back inside, John found Sarah sitting at the kitchen table, her face pale and drawn. "Dad, I heard someone calling my name," she said quietly, her voice barely more than a whisper. John felt a chill run down his spine. "It was just the wind, sweetheart," he said, trying to reassure her, though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. Sarah didn't argue, but her eyes held a strange look, a look that told John she didn't believe him. As the days went on, the strangeness in the village grew more pronounced. Sarah's dreams became more vivid, and she often woke in the middle of the night, screaming about figures standing at the foot of her bed. John tried everything to calm her: new nightlights, leaving her door open, sitting with her until she fell asleep, but nothing seemed to help. It wasn't long before John himself began experiencing strange things. He would wake in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside his room. At first, he assumed it was Sarah, but when he checked, she was always fast asleep in her bed. The villagers continued to avoid John and Sarah. Whenever John went into the village for supplies, he could feel their eyes on him, their whispers following him as he passed. No one would meet his gaze for long, and when he asked questions about the village's history, the answers were always vague, as if the villagers were afraid to speak too much. One day, he cornered an old man sitting outside the local tavern. The man, his face lined with age, looked up at John with a mixture of fear and pity. "You're new here, aren't you?" the old man said, his voice raspy. "You and your daughter. You don't know, do you?" "Know what?" John asked, his heart beginning to race. The old man glanced around, making sure no one was listening before he leaned in closer. "This village, it's cursed, has been for generations. People go missing, children mostly. They just vanish. And it's always the newcomers who are affected first. It's the spirits. They take them." John stared at the old man, unable to believe what he was hearing. "That's ridiculous," he said, though the fear in his voice betrayed his uncertainty. The old man shrugged. "Believe what you want, but you've been warned." John returned home that day with a heavy heart. He didn't want to believe the old man's story, but the signs were becoming harder to ignore. Sarah's strange behavior, the odd noises in the house, the villagers' reluctance to speak to him, it all pointed to something being terribly wrong in Hollow Creek. But John wasn't ready to give up. He was determined to protect his daughter, no matter what. John's mind raced as he tried to make sense of what the old man had told him. Cursed, spirits taking children. It all seemed impossible, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Every time he looked at Sarah, he saw the exhaustion in her eyes. She had always been so full of life, but now she looked pale and drained, as if something was slowly pulling the energy out of her. The dreams, the strange figures she mentioned, and now this, could it all be connected? John decided to investigate further. He couldn't rely on the villagers for answers. They were too afraid, too wrapped up in their silence. So that night, after Sarah had gone to bed, John sat down with the few books he had brought with him, determined to learn more about the village. He searched for any mention of Hollow Creek in history books, local folklore, anything that might give him a clue as to what was happening. But there was almost nothing. It was as if Hollow Creek had been deliberately erased from most records, hidden away in the shadows where no one could find it. Frustrated, John closed the last book and stared at the flickering flame of the candle on the table. The house was silent except for the occasional creak of the floorboards as the wind pushed against the old wooden walls. Suddenly, a faint whispering sound caught his attention. It was barely audible at first, like the rustling of leaves, but as he listened more closely, it became clearer. Voices, soft, eerie voices, coming from somewhere in the house. John's heart raced as he stood up and followed the sound. It seemed to be coming from Sarah's room. He hurried to her door, pushing it open quietly, and found her sitting up in bed, staring out the window. Her eyes were wide, unfocused, as if she were in a trance. "Sarah," John called softly, but she didn't respond. He stepped closer, reaching out to touch her shoulder. But just as his fingers grazed her skin, she snapped out of her trance and gasped, pulling away from him. "Dad," she whispered, her voice shaky. "They're here. They're watching me." "Who's watching you?" John asked, his voice barely steady. Sarah pointed to the window, and for the first time John saw it, the faint outline of a figure standing just beyond the glass, watching them. His blood ran cold. He rushed to the window, yanked it open, and looked outside, but the figure had already disappeared into the darkness. John slammed the window shut and turned back to Sarah, his heart pounding in his chest. "We're leaving," he said firmly. "We're leaving this village tomorrow." Sarah didn't argue. She simply nodded, her eyes filled with fear. John spent the rest of the night sitting by her bed, watching over her as she slept. He didn't sleep at all. His mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do next. Leaving the village seemed like the best option, but something deep down told him it wouldn't be that easy. Whatever was haunting Hollow Creek, whatever was targeting his daughter, wasn't going to let them leave without a fight. The next morning, John packed their bags quickly, determined to leave Hollow Creek as soon as possible. He didn't care where they went. Anywhere was better than here. But as they made their way through the village, heading toward the only road out, John felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The village seemed even more oppressive in the daylight, as if the very air was trying to hold them back. The few villagers they passed didn't speak. They simply watched, their eyes filled with silent warnings. Just as they reached the edge of the village, a sudden gust of wind swept through the trees, bringing with it a low, mournful wail. Sarah stopped in her tracks, her eyes wide with terror. "Dad, we can't leave," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They won't let us." John's stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "We have to go, Sarah. It's not safe here." But Sarah shook her head, her face pale. "I can hear them. They're saying if we leave, they'll come for us. They'll take me." John felt a cold chill run down his spine. He looked around, but there was no one else in sight. Just the empty road ahead, leading out of Hollow Creek. But Sarah's fear was palpable, and something deep inside him told him she was right. They couldn't leave, not yet. Reluctantly, John turned back toward the village. They returned to the cottage, and John's mind raced with questions. Why were they being targeted? What did the spirits want with Sarah, and how could he stop them? That night, John decided to confront the spirits directly. He didn't know what else to do. Running wasn't an option, and he couldn't just sit by and let them take his daughter. As the sun set and the darkness crept in, John sat by the fireplace waiting. He had no plan, no idea what to expect, but he was ready to face whatever came for them. Hours passed, and the house remained eerily quiet. Sarah had fallen asleep, exhausted from the day's events, and John sat alone in the flickering firelight, his thoughts racing. Just as he was beginning to think that maybe nothing would happen, the temperature in the room suddenly dropped. The fire sputtered, and the shadows on the walls seemed to lengthen, twisting and writhing as if alive. John stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice echoing in the silence. "What do you want?" For a long moment, there was no response. Then, from the darkness, a voice whispered, so faint it was barely audible. "We are the lost. We are the forgotten." John's breath caught in his throat. "What do you want with my daughter?" Another long silence. Then the voice came again, stronger this time. "She is the next. She must join us." John's heart raced. "No, I won't let you take her." The shadows on the walls seemed to pulse, and the temperature dropped even further. "You cannot stop us. The village is ours. The children belong to us." John's hands clenched into fists. "Why? Why are you doing this?" For a moment, the shadows seemed to hesitate, as if considering his question. Then, the voice spoke again, low and mournful. "We were betrayed. Our lives were stolen, and now we take what was taken from us." John's mind reeled. "What do you mean? Betrayed by who?" The shadows flickered, and the fire suddenly flared up, casting a harsh light across the room. For a brief moment, John saw them, ghostly figures standing in the corners of the room, their eyes hollow, their faces twisted in pain. The village, the elders, they promised us safety, but they lied. We were sacrificed, and now we take our revenge. John's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't know what to say, how to respond. The spirits had been wronged, and now they were taking their revenge on the village, on the children. But that didn't mean he could let them take Sarah. He had to find a way to stop them. The figures in the room began to fade, their whispers growing softer until they were barely audible. "She will be ours," they whispered, their voices trailing off into the darkness. As the room returned to normal, John collapsed into a chair, his mind racing. He had learned something, but it wasn't enough. The spirits were angry, but they weren't telling him the whole story. He needed more answers, and fast. The next day, John set out to find someone, anyone, who could help him. He couldn't do this alone, but the villagers had made it clear they wouldn't get involved. They were too afraid, too used to the way things were. But John wasn't willing to accept that. He wouldn't let Sarah become another victim of Hollow Creek's curse. After asking around town and being met with nothing but silence and avoidance, John finally found someone who seemed willing to talk. It was the same old man who had warned him before, sitting outside the tavern with a pipe in his hand. His eyes were sharp, watching John approach with a mixture of curiosity and pity. "They spoke to you, didn't they?" the old man said, not bothering with pleasantries. John nodded. "They want my daughter. They said she's the next." The old man sighed, shaking his head. "I told you, didn't I? This place, it's cursed. The spirits of the children who were taken, they're trapped here, angry, seeking revenge." "Why? What happened to them?" The old man took a long drag on his pipe, staring off into the distance. "It happened a long time ago. The village was different then, poorer, struggling to survive. The elders, they made a deal, a dark deal. They thought they were saving the village, but they didn't realize what they were doing. They sacrificed the children to some thing. They thought it would bring prosperity, but all it brought was death." John's stomach turned, and now the spirits are taking their revenge. The old man nodded. "They want the children. They want what was stolen from them. Every few years, they come for another one. And once they've chosen, there's no escaping it." John's mind reeled with the weight of what the old man had told him. The village elders had sacrificed children to save themselves, and now the spirits were exacting their revenge. Sarah was the next target. He couldn't let it happen. He wouldn't. But how could he stop it? The spirits were relentless, and the villagers had already given up. They wouldn't help him, and the old man made it clear that once a child was chosen, there was no escape. But John wasn't ready to give up. "There must be a way," he said, his voice low but determined. "How do I stop them?" The old man looked at him, pity in his eyes. "You can't stop them. No one can. The village has been cursed for decades. The spirits come for the children, and there's nothing anyone can do." John clenched his fists, refusing to accept the old man's hopelessness. "There has to be a way. There has to be something I can do." The old man took another drag on his pipe, then let out a long, weary sigh. "There is one thing, but it's dangerous, and it might not work." John leaned forward, desperate for any scrap of hope. "What is it?" The old man hesitated, as if weighing whether or not to tell John the truth. "There's an old ritual, something the village used to perform before things got out of control. It's dangerous, though. You're not just dealing with spirits. You're dealing with forces far older than this village. Dark forces. If you fail, the spirits will take you too. But if you succeed, you might be able to break the curse." John didn't hesitate. "What do I need to do?" The old man set down his pipe and stood up, gesturing for John to follow him. They walked through the village, heading toward the outskirts where the forest began. The trees loomed tall and dark, their branches twisting together like gnarled fingers. As they entered the forest, the air grew colder, and the wind whispered through the leaves like a distant, mournful cry. After what felt like hours of walking, they reached a small clearing. In the center stood a stone altar, worn down by time and covered in moss. It looked ancient, as if it had been there long before the village was ever built. The old man gestured to the altar. "This is where it must be done. The ritual to break the curse." John stared at the altar, his heart pounding in his chest. "How does it work?" The old man stepped forward, his voice grave. "You will need 3 things: a token of innocence, a symbol of the village's betrayal, and a sacrifice, something precious to you. You will offer these things to the spirits, and they will judge whether you are worthy of breaking the curse. If they accept your offering, Sarah will be spared. But if they don't..." John didn't need him to finish the sentence. He knew what was at stake. He nodded, his jaw set with determination. "I'll do it, whatever it takes." The old man gave him a long, hard look. "You're a brave man, but bravery won't be enough. The spirits will test you. They will push you to the edge. If you falter, even for a moment, you will lose everything." John met the old man's gaze. "I won't fail. I can't." With that, the old man handed John a small, worn book. "This will guide you through the ritual. But remember, once you begin, there is no turning back." Back at the cottage, John sat down at the kitchen table. The old book spread out in front of him. Its pages were yellowed with age, the writing faded in places, but the instructions were clear. He needed a token of innocence, something that represented Sarah's pure soul, untouched by the darkness of the village. He would also need a symbol of the betrayal that had cursed the village in the first place, something that connected him to the past, to the sacrifice that had started it all. And finally, a sacrifice of his own, something precious, something that mattered more to him than anything else. John's mind raced as he tried to think of what to use. The token of innocence was easy. Sarah's favorite doll, the one she had clung to since she was a baby. It had been her constant companion, a symbol of the innocence she was about to lose if the spirits took her. The symbol of betrayal was harder. John thought about the village, about the elders who had sacrificed their own children to save themselves. What could represent that betrayal? He remembered the stories he had heard about the village's founding, how the first settlers had made a pact with something in the forest, trading the lives of their children for safety. He needed something connected to that pact, something that would remind the spirits of the betrayal that had condemned them to their fate. John stood up and walked to the mantel where an old rusted key hung. He had found it when they first moved into the house, but he hadn't given it much thought. Now, though, it seemed to call to him. The key was heavy in his hand, its surface worn smooth by time. He didn't know what it unlocked, but something told him it was connected to the village's dark past. The final part of the ritual, the sacrifice, was the hardest. The book said he had to offer something that mattered more to him than anything else. John looked at Sarah, sleeping peacefully in her bed. She was the most important thing in the world to him. But he couldn't sacrifice her. He wouldn't. But what could he offer in her place? His eyes fell on a small wooden box sitting on the dresser. Inside was a picture of Sarah's mother, John's late wife. It was the last photo they had taken together before she passed away, and John had carried it with him ever since. The thought of losing it, of giving it up, felt unbearable. But if it meant saving Sarah, he would do it. He would do anything. John placed the photo in the box, along with the doll and the key. His heart felt heavy as he closed the lid, sealing the objects inside. Tomorrow, he would take them to the altar in the forest and perform the ritual. He didn't know what would happen, but he knew he had to try. The following night, John set out into the forest with Sarah by his side. She didn't fully understand what was happening, but she trusted her father. As they walked, the trees seemed to close in around them, the shadows growing darker and more menacing with every step. The air was thick with tension, as if the very forest was watching them, waiting to see what would happen. When they reached the clearing, the stone altar stood before them, illuminated by the pale light of the moon. John placed the wooden box on the altar and opened it, laying out the doll, the key, and the photograph. His hands shook as he followed the instructions from the book, chanting the ancient words that had been written in a language long forgotten. At first, nothing happened. The forest was silent, the air still. But then, slowly, the temperature began to drop. The wind picked up, swirling around them in a frenzy. John could feel the presence of the spirits, watching, waiting. He pressed on, his voice steady as he continued the chant, his heart pounding in his chest. Suddenly, the wind stopped, and the clearing was plunged into an eerie silence. The shadows around the altar began to shift, and one by one, the spirits appeared. They were barely visible at first, just faint outlines in the darkness. But as they moved closer, their faces became clearer. They were children, their eyes hollow, their expressions twisted with pain and anger. John's breath caught in his throat. He had known the spirits were children, but seeing them like this, so full of sorrow and rage, was almost too much to bear. He could feel their pain, their longing for revenge, and he knew that breaking the curse wouldn't be easy. The spirits circled the altar, their voices whispering in the wind. "Why do you come here?" they asked, their voices echoing through the clearing. "Why do you seek to break the curse?" John's heart raced as he stepped forward. "I come to save my daughter. I come to make things right." The spirits stopped, their hollow eyes fixed on John. "You cannot make things right. The village betrayed us. They took our lives. Now we take theirs." John swallowed hard. "I know, but my daughter, she didn't do anything. She's innocent." The spirits didn't move. "Innocence means nothing. She will join us." John's voice trembled as he spoke. "No, I won't let that happen. I've brought an offering. I've brought a sacrifice." For a long moment, the spirits were silent. Then one of them, a young girl, her face pale and ghostly, stepped forward. "Show us." John's hands shook as he reached for the wooden box. He lifted the doll first, holding it up for the spirits to see. "This is her doll. It's a symbol of her innocence." The spirits watched, their expressions unreadable. John placed the doll on the altar and reached for the rusted key. "This key, it's a symbol of the village's betrayal. It's connected to the pact that was made all those years ago." Again, the spirits said nothing. John's heart pounded in his chest as he lifted the photograph from the box. His hands trembled as he held it up. "And this is my sacrifice. It's the last picture I have of my wife. She was Sarah's mother. This is the most precious thing I have. I'm offering it to you in exchange for my daughter's life." The photograph shook in John's trembling hands as he placed it on the altar beside the doll and the key. The clearing was deathly silent, the air thick with anticipation. The spirits, their hollow eyes fixed on the offerings, floated closer, circling the altar like a cloud of sorrow and anger. John could feel the weight of their judgment, their pain, pressing down on him. The young girl who had stepped forward, the one who had spoken for the spirits, studied the photograph for a long moment. Her eyes, empty yet filled with centuries of anguish, lingered on the image of John's wife. The other spirits began to murmur softly, their voices barely audible but filled with sorrow. John's heart pounded in his chest, his breaths shallow. He didn't know if the offerings would be enough. What if the spirits rejected them? What if they still wanted Sarah? The fear clawed at him, threatening to overwhelm his resolve, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had to stay strong for Sarah. Finally, the young girl looked up at John, her face twisted with a mixture of longing and pain. "You bring us these things," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper, "but they do not ease our suffering. What are your offerings compared to the lives that were stolen from us? What are your sacrifices when we have lost everything?" John swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I can't undo what was done to you," he said, his voice shaky but determined. "I can't bring back the lives you lost, but my daughter is innocent. She doesn't deserve to suffer for the sins of the past." The spirits murmured again, their voices rising like a breeze through the trees. The young girl's expression hardened, her eyes narrowing as she stepped closer to John. "Innocence does not matter here. You two are part of this village now. You carry its sins. Your daughter is ours." John's heart clenched. He couldn't lose Sarah. Not now, not after everything. He had to think of something, anything, to convince the spirits to let her go. "I understand your pain," he said quickly, his voice desperate. "I understand that you were wronged, that you were betrayed by those who were supposed to protect you. But punishing Sarah won't bring you peace. It won't fix what happened to you." The spirits were silent, watching him with unblinking eyes. John took a deep breath, gathering his courage. "But maybe," he continued, "if you let Sarah go, if you end this cycle of revenge, you can find peace. You don't have to keep taking the children. You don't have to keep reliving your pain. You can move on." For a long moment, the clearing was silent. The spirits hovered, their expressions unreadable. John could feel his heart racing, his pulse pounding in his ears. He didn't know if his words had reached them, if they had made any difference at all. Then, slowly, the young girl turned her gaze toward Sarah, who stood silently by her father's side, clutching his hand. The girl's hollow eyes softened, just slightly, as if for the first time she saw Sarah not as a target, but as a child, innocent and vulnerable, just as she and the other spirits had once been. "We were children once," the girl whispered, her voice filled with a deep, aching sadness. "Just like her." The other spirits murmured in agreement, their voices barely more than whispers in the wind. The young girl turned back to John, her expression still filled with sorrow, but now there was something else, something softer, less vengeful. "We will consider your offering," she said quietly. "But know this, the curse on this village runs deep. It cannot be undone so easily." John nodded, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely steady. "Thank you for giving her a chance." The spirits began to fade, their forms dissolving into the mist that swirled through the clearing. But before they disappeared entirely, the young girl's voice echoed through the air one last time. "You will know our decision soon." The walk back to the cottage felt heavier than any journey John had ever taken. Though the spirits had not outright rejected his offering, their cryptic message lingered in his mind, gnawing at his thoughts. "You will know our decision soon," they had said. But what did that mean? Was it a promise of hope or a veiled threat? As they reached the cottage, John glanced at Sarah. She had been unusually quiet throughout the entire ordeal. Her small hand still clutched his, but her eyes held a distant look, as if she were trying to understand what had just happened. John knelt beside her, his voice soft. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" Sarah looked at him, her voice barely a whisper. "They're still watching me, Dad. Even when we were in the forest, I could feel them." John's heart clenched. He knew that Sarah's sensitivity to the spirits had only grown stronger since they had arrived in Hollow Creek. She could sense them in ways that he couldn't, and that terrified him. "I'm going to protect you," he said firmly, pulling her into a tight embrace. "No matter what happens, I won't let them take you." But deep down, John wasn't sure what would happen next. He had done everything he could, made the offerings, pleaded with the spirits, but the future was uncertain. The weight of the village's dark history loomed over him like a storm cloud, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was still coming. That night, sleep did not come easily. John lay awake, listening to the creaks and groans of the old cottage as the wind howled outside. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow seemed darker. He found himself watching the door, half expecting the spirits to return, to take Sarah in the middle of the night. But the night passed without incident. The spirits did not come. When dawn broke, John breathed a small sigh of relief. Perhaps the worst was over. 2 days passed without any sign of the spirits. Sarah seemed calmer, though the distant look in her eyes hadn't entirely faded. John spent every waking moment with her, refusing to leave her alone even for a second. He couldn't shake the feeling that the spirits were still watching, waiting to make their final decision. Then, on the third night, everything changed. It was late, well past midnight, when John awoke to the sound of someone calling his name. At first, he thought it was just a dream, but when he opened his eyes, the voice came again, louder this time. "John." His heart pounded as he sat up, his eyes scanning the room. The air felt thick, suffocating, and the temperature had dropped significantly. He knew the spirits were near. His first thought was of Sarah. He rushed to her room, only to find her bed empty. Panic surged through him as he frantically searched the house, but there was no sign of her. Then he heard it, the soft sound of footsteps outside, crunching through the dead leaves that littered the ground. John ran to the window and peered out into the darkness, his breath caught in his throat. There, standing at the edge of the forest, was Sarah. She stood perfectly still, her face turned toward the trees, as if listening to something only she could hear, and surrounding her, barely visible in the pale moonlight, were the spirits, faint, ghostly figures drifting through the shadows. John's heart pounded in his chest, He didn't hesitate. Grabbing a flashlight, he bolted out of the house and into the yard, calling out to her, "Sarah, Sarah, come back." But she didn't move. It was as if she were in a trance, drawn to the spirit's call. John ran toward her, his feet slipping on the damp grass as he crossed the yard. The closer he got, the colder the air became, and the shadows seemed to press in around him, as if trying to pull him back. "Sarah," he shouted again, his voice hoarse with fear. Finally, Sarah turned toward him, her face pale and expressionless. "They want me, Dad," she said, her voice distant. "They're taking me." "No," John gasped, reaching for her hand. "I won't let them." Suddenly, the spirits moved. They circled around John and Sarah, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. The young girl, the one who had spoken for the spirits, appeared before them, her ghostly form flickering in the moonlight. "The decision has been made," she said softly, her hollow eyes locking onto John's. "The curse cannot be broken." John's heart sank. "But the offering?" The young girl shook her head. "It was not enough. The curse is too old, too strong. Your daughter will join us." John felt as if the ground had been ripped out from beneath him. "No," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Please, don't take her. Take me instead. I'll go with you. Just let her go." The spirits whispered among themselves, their voices rising like a gust of wind. The young girl watched John closely, her eyes filled with an ancient sadness. "You would sacrifice yourself for her?" John's chest tightened. "Yes, whatever it takes. Just let her go." The young girl hesitated, her gaze flickering between John and Sarah. The spirit's whispers grew louder, more urgent, until finally, the young girl spoke again. "Very well. We will take you in her place. But know this, once you join us, there is no return. You will be bound to this place forever." John nodded, his heart breaking. "I understand." The air grew still as the spirits closed in around John. He could feel their cold presence pressing against his skin, their whispers filling his ears. His body trembled with fear, but his resolve never wavered. He would give his life for Sarah. There was no other choice. The young girl reached out, her ghostly hand hovering just above John's chest. "It is done," she whispered. Suddenly, Sarah broke free from her trance. "No," she cried, grabbing onto her father's arm. "Don't do it, Dad, please." John turned to her, his eyes filled with tears. "I have to, sweetheart. It's the only way." Sarah sobbed, clinging to him with all her strength. "I don't want to lose you." John knelt down, pulling her into a tight embrace. "You won't lose me, Sarah. I'll always be with you. But I need you to be strong, okay? You need to live your life. Be happy." The young girl raised her hand, and the spirits moved closer, their ghostly forms flickering in the moonlight. "It is time," the girl whispered. John kissed Sarah's forehead, then stood up, facing the spirits with a mixture of fear and acceptance. He nodded once, his heart heavy but resolute. The young girl's hand touched his chest, and in an instant, John felt a coldness spread through him, a coldness that reached deep into his soul. His body went rigid, and for a moment, he felt as if he were being pulled in every direction at once, his mind fracturing under the weight of the spirit's presence. But then, it was over. The spirits began to fade, dissolving into the darkness like mist in the wind. The young girl, her eyes filled with a strange kind of peace, stepped back, her form growing fainter with each passing second. "You are one of us now," she whispered. "And she is free." John's world blurred as the coldness of the spirit seeped into him. The last thing he saw before everything faded was Sarah, her tear-streaked face lit by the moonlight. She stood there, frozen in place, her small frame trembling as she reached for him one final time. But as the darkness swallowed him, John felt something strange, a sense of peace. He had done what he came to do. Sarah was safe. The wind howled through the trees, and for a moment, it seemed as if the entire forest was mourning his loss. The spirits had retreated, their whispers no longer filling the air, and the oppressive weight that had hung over Hollow Creek for so long seemed to lift ever so slightly. The curse wasn't broken, but the cycle, at least for now, was complete. Sarah collapsed to the ground, her sobs echoing through the clearing. She felt the warmth of her father's presence vanish, replaced by the eerie silence of the night. The spirits were gone, but so was John. He had sacrificed himself for her, and now she was alone. Or so she thought. Just as Sarah thought she couldn't bear it any longer, a warm hand touched her shoulder. She looked up to see the old man from the village, the one who had told her father about the curse. His face was solemn, but there was a kindness in his eyes. "He's gone, child," the old man said softly. "But he did it for you. He gave everything to keep you safe." Sarah's voice trembled. Why? Why did it have to be him? Why couldn't they just leave us alone? The old man sighed and knelt down beside her. "Because the spirits are bound to this place, to the sins of the past. The village is cursed, and until that curse is lifted, the spirits will always demand a sacrifice." "But he didn't deserve this," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking. "He was a good man." The old man nodded slowly. "I know, child. But sometimes, good people are the ones who have to make the hardest choices. Your father loved you more than anything in this world. He would have done anything to save you. And now, he's given you a chance to live." Sarah wiped her tears with the back of her hand, trying to steady her breathing. She couldn't let her father's sacrifice be in vain. He had given everything for her, and now she had to find the strength to go on. "Will I ever see him again?" she asked quietly, her voice barely audible. The old man's eyes softened. "In time, perhaps. But for now, you must go on without him. The village may be cursed, but you are free, and your father will always be with you, even if you can't see him." The days that followed John's sacrifice were filled with an eerie stillness. Sarah returned to the cottage, but it no longer felt like home. Every room, every corner of the house reminded her of her father, his tools left on the kitchen table, the chair where he used to sit and read, the faint scent of his cologne that still lingered in the air. It was unbearable, but Sarah couldn't bring herself to leave, not yet. The villagers, who had always kept their distance from John and Sarah, now looked at her with a mixture of sympathy and guilt. They knew what had happened. Word of John's sacrifice had spread quickly through Hollow Creek. Some of the villagers left small offerings of food or flowers at Sarah's doorstep, but none dared to speak to her directly. They knew that their silence and complicity had played a role in what had happened. The old man visited Sarah every day, bringing her food and checking on her well-being. He didn't say much. He knew that no words could truly ease the pain she felt, but his presence was a small comfort. He told her stories about the village's past, about the time before the curse had taken hold, when Hollow Creek had been a place of happiness and prosperity. It was hard for Sarah to imagine, but she listened, clinging to the hope that maybe, one day, the village could be free of its dark history. The other villagers, however, seemed resigned to their fate. They had lived with the curse for so long that they no longer believed it could ever be broken. To them, John's sacrifice was just another chapter in the village's long, tragic history. They expected the spirits to return, to demand another child in a few years' time, and they would be right back where they started. But Sarah wasn't ready to accept that. She couldn't. Her father had given his life to protect her, and she refused to believe that his sacrifice had been for nothing. Weeks passed, and though the weight of her father's loss still hung heavy over her, Sarah began to find small moments of peace. She spent her days wandering the village, exploring the surrounding woods, and visiting the places where she and her father had once walked together. It was painful at first, but gradually, the pain gave way to a quiet sense of gratitude. Her father had loved her so deeply, and that love had given her the strength to carry on. One day, while walking along the riverbank, Sarah found herself standing at the edge of the forest, the same forest where her father had made his sacrifice. She stared into the trees, half expecting to see the spirits watching her from the shadows. But the forest was quiet. The oppressive feeling that had once clung to the village seemed to have lifted, if only slightly. The spirits had taken John, but they hadn't returned since. As she stood there, lost in thought, the old man appeared beside her, his cane tapping softly against the ground. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there with her, looking out at the trees. "Do you think it's over?" Sarah asked after a long silence. The old man sighed. The curse isn't over, not yet. But for now, the spirits are quiet. Your father's sacrifice gave the village some peace, even if it's only temporary. Sarah nodded, her eyes fixed on the forest. Do you think the curse can ever be broken? The old man was silent for a long time, considering her question. Perhaps, he said finally, but it would take more than just one sacrifice. The village's sins run deep. It will take time, maybe generations, to fully undo the damage that was done. Sarah nodded again, her heart heavy. I want to try, she said quietly. I don't want anyone else to go through what my father did. The old man looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and admiration. You have your father's spirit, he said softly. He would be proud of you. As the seasons changed, so did Sarah. She grew stronger, not just in body but in spirit. The village of Hollow Creek still bore the scars of its dark past, but Sarah was determined to carve out a future for herself, one that honored her father's memory. She spent her days tending to the cottage, planting a small garden in the yard, where she and her father had once sat together. It became a place of quiet reflection, a place where Sarah could feel connected to him, even though he was gone. The villagers continued to keep their distance, but over time, a few began to approach Sarah with kindness. They knew what she had been through, and some of them, especially the younger ones, were inspired by her strength. They began to help her with the garden, bringing seeds and tools, and slowly, Sarah found herself building a new life, even amidst the ruins of the old one. The old man continued to visit, sharing stories of the village's past and offering guidance when Sarah needed it. He told her about the other villages nearby, about places where life wasn't bound by curses and ancient rituals. And though Sarah knew she could leave Hollow Creek, that she could start fresh somewhere far from the haunted village, she chose to stay. This was her home now, and she wanted to honor her father's sacrifice by making it a place of healing. The spirits, for the most part, remained silent. Every now and then, Sarah would feel a chill in the air, or catch a glimpse of something moving in the shadows, but she no longer feared them. She had faced the darkness and survived, and now, she was determined to build a future, one where the spirits no longer held power over the village. Years passed, and Sarah grew into a strong and wise woman. She never forgot her father's sacrifice, and though the memories of that night in the forest still haunted her dreams, she found peace in knowing that he had saved her. The village of Hollow Creek remained a quiet, haunted place, but under Sarah's care, it began to heal, just as she had. The curse of the village was not broken, but for the first time in generations, there was hope. Sarah knew that it would take time, perhaps lifetimes, but she was patient. She had learned from her father that love and sacrifice were the most powerful forces of all, and with that knowledge, she believed that one day the spirits would find peace and the village would be free. As she stood in the garden one evening, watching the sun set over the distant hills, Sarah whispered a quiet promise to the wind. I will never forget you, Dad. I will make this place better for you. And in the quiet stillness of the evening, she felt his presence, like a warm breeze that brushed against her skin. He was still with her, watching over her, just as he had always promised. The haunting of Hollow Creek would continue, but so would Sarah's fight to end it, and in that fight, she knew she was not alone.